So, one of the two videos that the fine folks over on Patreon voted for this month was a collaboration with Tasting History with Max Miller on the subject of US Navy ice cream and ice cream barges. As those of you who are subscribed to his channel will have already seen, by sheer coincidence, he seems to have actually done a video of his own on the subject earlier this month, or perhaps the Venn diagram of people who like to hear about history and those who like to eat it overlap more than I originally anticipated. Nonetheless, here's my offering. Now, while some of the information might sound familiar, if you've seen the other video, I'll also try and add a little bit more information on the naval side of things. Now, ice cream, of course, has a very long history, but where it comes into play with the US Navy is in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Prior to this, the US Navy, when Congress allowed it to exist in any significant numbers, had largely been confined to what we would now call coastal defense duties. There were the occasional notable exceptions, like the quasi-war with France, the expeditions against the Barbary pirates, and some of the commerce raiding missions from the War of 1812, for example. But all of these took place in the Age of Sail, well before the advent of refrigeration aboard ships, and thus ice cream overseas was not exactly on the cards unless you could find some during a port visit. Refrigeration aboard ships was introduced by the French from the mid to late 1870s and then spread gradually across the world, with the British beginning to use it in the 1880s, much as the French had done, to transport frozen meat from far-flung places to their home countries, beef coming from Argentina to France for the French, and lamb coming from New Zealand to the UK for the British. Meanwhile, back in the USA, ice cream was slowly growing into something of a national obsession. It had been part of the US diet, at least amongst some, since before the US had been the US, back when it had been the 13 colonies. By the time of independence, some of the better-off Americans were spending $100 or more a year on it, back in that time when the amount that they were spending was roughly the equivalent to 5 or 6 average workers' annual income. As the popularity of the cold treat became greater, so too did the inventiveness in how to consume it. With the invention of ice cream soda, or ice cream floats, as those of us outside of the States would call it, and that of the ice cream sundae, both being attributed in several sources to 19th century Americans, although they disagree as to exactly which 19th century Americans. As the US Navy was allowed to venture further and further overseas, was increasingly based in warmer climates like the ports of California and later on the Philippines, along with various other southern US and Caribbean ports, the need to keep up morale and also provide a cooling snack, as well as some air conditioning, increased. Whereas over in the Royal Navy, which generally had a much colder remit, the installation of steam heating and tea kettles was more of a priority. With the US Navy also becoming a steel navy, the carriage and even manufacture of ice cream in the fleet became more and more common. Then, in 1914, the US Navy went dry, and alcohol, the main luxury that was afforded to sailors in navies across the world for many centuries, was banned aboard ships. Whilst illicit stills and smuggling crates from ashore did mitigate this impact somewhat, it was nothing close to enough to keep an entire crew going for weeks or months at sea, and so ice cream became even more important as a morale-raising and temperature-cooling staple. The passage of the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, increased the consumption of ice cream ashore, and this had a knock-on effect at sea, as increasing demand, of course, meant more pressure being put on manufacturers to invent faster, more compact, and better quality manufacturing and storage solutions, which could then find their way into smaller and smaller ships or expand larger ships' production capabilities. Whilst Prohibition ended in the USA in the mid-1920s, the US Navy itself remained, and officially remains, a dry navy. Now fast forward to World War II, and whilst those ashore had to deal with a brief period where ice cream supplies ran short as it was determined, prior of course to extensive lobbying that saw the decision reversed, that ice cream was not an essential wartime commodity, nobody was quite dumb enough to try and take the ice cream away from the increasing number of heavily armed men that comprised the US Armed Forces, and who would now have to fight in the sweltering Pacific and Mediterranean for the middle years of the war, before adding the still warm but slightly less boiling theatre of Northern Europe to the mix as well, come the summer of 1944. But of course, wartime crews for ships are larger. There were more ships than the fleet, And these ships were coming in a bewildering variety, everything from very small escorts, as well as various auxiliaries purchased into service, and hundreds of miscellaneous support vessels that don't fit into a neat submarine, destroyer, cruiser, battleship, carrier paradigm. Not all of these were supplied with or could fit ice cream making facilities. Even many fleet destroyers lacked this, at least at first. And with long deployments in the midst of the ocean, and crew numbers only increasing further still as radar and more anti-aircraft guns, to say nothing of other features, were fitted to ships, even those ships that had ice cream making facilities began to feel the strain. Deep cold storage could only do so much, there was only a limited amount of it, and you had to store other things like meat there, and soon it was clear that something would need to be done. On some ships, that resulted in their officers and men conspiring to acquire the means of production by any means necessary. More above-board and caring officers would sometimes acquire ice cream making machines using their own money. Other times, the crew simply identified a ship that they knew happened to be equipped with an ice cream maker or two, and also happened to have somewhat poor security, and then simply stole what they needed. In one memorable incident, a submarine's crew timed their raid on a nearby battleship such that they only just scrambled back aboard the sub before it was due to sail, and in the few hours it took for the battleship's crew to realise that they'd been robbed, work out who'd done it, then report it up the line, the submarine was at sea and, well, tragically it had dived beyond the range of immediate radio communications, and so could not be recalled to return the stolen goods. As the Pacific campaign advanced, so did the distance from places like Pearl Harbor, where ships could be resupplied with both fresh ice cream and the components to make more once they were out at sea. But around this time, even the United States was suffering from supply shortages in its shipbuilding industry, specifically a steel shortage. The shortage was so acute that it was even affecting the construction of major surface combatants. The Alaska class, for example, were delayed so that steel could be diverted to carriers and escorts. So no matter how vital to morale it was, there was no way that anyone was going to be able to justify building a floating ice cream making vessel specifically using normal ship construction methods. But since there were plenty of other supplies that also needed to be moved around, and there were similar constrictions on those ships' construction, the US was also building a series of barges made out of ferroconcrete, an idea that had seen a handful of similar ships built in World War I. This involved forming a kind of mesh skeleton out of steel, a lot of it rebar that really didn't have to be particularly high quality as compared to the SDS steel that was used in most warships, and then you cast a concrete hull through and around this mesh. The vessel thus formed used relatively small amounts of low-quality steel, and thus allowed the supply fleet to keep up with demand. Built mostly in California, with another run of them built in Florida and a small handful built in other yards, these concrete barges were operated both by the US Army and the US Navy, and they followed two primary naming plans. The first was the rather uninspiring YO, YOG, and YOGN series, where these letters were then followed by a dash with some numbers to designate a specific hull, such as YO85, YOG186, or YOGN118. The other significant naming plan was to use various elements and minerals, meaning that there was a USS Sodium, USS Iridium, USS Bromide, USS Quartz, USS Bauxite, and of course USS Feldspar, all in service at one point or another. Some of these vessels were capable of moving under their own power, whilst others, including a significant number of those that had actual names, and the YOGNs, were only capable of moving under tow. The N actually specifically stood for not able to move under its own propulsion. The 24 barges built in Florida were named after people, mostly engineers that had been involved at some point in history at that time in the US cement and concrete industry. Most of these concrete vessels came in at around the length of a large destroyer, most being about 366 foot long, but they were considerably wider in the beam, almost twice as much in some cases, and so they displaced considerably more. They also obviously didn't need to have fine ends. The weight on commission of most of them being between 5,000 and 6,000 tons, whilst they were also capable of then transporting roughly their own weight again in supplies and equipment once they were fully loaded, which meant that they would then have the displacement of a relatively large cruiser. One run of barges was somewhat smaller, at 265 feet long, and displaced about 1,600 tons when freshly launched, and therefore just over 3,000 tons when fully loaded. Their thick concrete hulls lent themselves quite well to storing goods at consistent and regulated temperatures, and so quite a number were fitted out to transport refrigerated goods. And the idea came to fit some of these barges to both carry and manufacture ice cream. There seems to be some confusion about exactly how many of these ships there were, with the most commonly cited figures in modern articles seeming to talk about a single barge converted at a cost of $1 million, able to create 500 gallons of ice cream a day and store another 2,000 gallons of pre-made ice cream in its holds. It's usually held that this marvellous vessel was then stationed at Ulithi. However, period sources appear to disagree with this assessment, with multiple military and industry sources from the war itself and immediately thereafter citing either 3 or 11 such vessels, with a number of sailors recounting being able to take advantage of such a vessel at Guadalcanal, well after the campaign to capture it, and another source reporting that the barge at Ulithi was moored alongside a similar unit that was entirely dedicated to the supply of Coca-Cola. One US Army history document from the 1950s even has every single one of the 265-foot barges capable of manufacturing and storing large amounts of ice cream, which would make a minimum of more than 27 hulls, since it's clear that at least some of the ice cream barges that were encountered were of the much larger 366-foot variant. However, most of these sources note that the barges carried and made ice cream in addition to carrying a variety of other chilled supplies, mostly frozen meat. So perhaps there was only one purely ice cream making barge, with the balance of its cargo space given over to the raw supplies to make even more ice cream, and the rest of these ice cream making barges were multi-purpose. But without further digging into the fine details of exactly which concrete barge did what, it's impossible to say anything else other than there were almost certainly a number of concrete-hulled ice cream factories touring the Pacific. Whilst these barges, whatever their number, were being manufactured, the troops could be found taking other measures that went beyond larceny to guarantee their supplies. One scheme involved strapping a can that had been filled with a basic mixture made of either canned or condensed milk, again sources vary, which had been combined with cocoa powder, onto an F4U Corsair, which would then fly up to over 30,000 feet, in the hopes that the engine vibration and the cold would turn the mix into ice cream. This failed to have any initial effect on the first attempt because the can was far too close to the engine, whose exhaust heat had kept the mixture liquid. Moving the can further away yielded frozen milk flavoured with cocoa, and after a bit of lateral thinking, somebody improvised a churner for the can, which was manufactured out of the spare miniature propellers that were usually used to arm bombs safely once they fell away from the aircraft, which was then connected to a paddle inside the can. This solution worked, and meant that frontline units, at least frontline units associated with this particular pilot, on recently captured islands, could have their own ice cream, of a sort. And if this thing sounds like a slightly different take on something you may have heard me mention before, well, over in Europe, RAF pilots had made themselves very popular with the troops in Europe by strapping kegs of beer onto the wing hardpoints of their Spitfires when they were shuttling over from the UK, thus delivering a well-chilled beer upon landing. And other ice cream generating mechanisms using aircraft were common across many US Air Force outposts, as well as the US Navy and the US Marine Corps, of course. Now, ice cream itself came in two basic forms when you were in the US Navy. These are preserved in the Cookbook of the United States Navy, the relevant extracts of which can be found on the Nauticus website. This is the museum that preserves, amongst other things, the battleship USS Wisconsin, so if you search for Nauticus along with Cooking for the Crew, you'll find the article in question. Now, the first option was pretty simple, to be honest. A dry mix of ice cream powder that was apparently a completely neutral flavour, which was the most common type that you would find in the United States Navy, since the dry mix could be easily stored, it didn't even have to be refrigerated, and it was pretty fast to make. You simply combined it with water, or milk if you wanted an extra creamy solution, and then added whatever kind of flavouring you liked. The default suggested being to add 12 vanilla flavouring tablets to the 100 portion recipe, which called for 9 pounds of dry mix, in addition to 1 3/4 gallons of cold water, all of which was then poured into what I can only presume was a truly impressively powerful mixer. But when you go to the galleys of most US battleships, which have been preserved as museums, you will find some truly impressively powerful mixers. Other flavour options for this mix that were suggested include apricot, cherry, banana, date, grape, pineapple, peach, and strawberry, all of which call for some variation on mashing various amounts of these fruits up and then usually forcing them through a sieve before adding them to the mixture, with a number also calling for an appropriate coloured food colouring and sometimes a flavoured syrup as well, as the natural flavour of some of these fruits may not be strong enough in the quantities that you could safely add without ruining the ice cream mix. Flavoured syrups for ice cream were widely known in the US at least since the 1920s, and as well as supplementing actual fruit, they could also be used on their own if fresh fruit could not be obtained or it had gone bad. Nuts could also be added to some of the mixtures, and there were 2 versions of the recipe for chocolate ice cream. One simply just chucked a ton of chocolate flavour syrup in, and the other used cocoa powder mixed with water. Likewise, maple could be had from tablets or from syrup if you were really nice to a passing Canadian ship. There was also a coffee ice cream mix that would just call for somebody to brew up 6.5 pints of coffee and substitute that for 6.5 pints of water from the 1 3/4 gallon mix. Then there was the more complex version. Now, this would take longer to prepare and involved a lot more ingredients and a lot more work in the galley, and that involved cornstarch, sugar, salt, powdered eggs, and powdered milk, because again, they travelled better, along with water and, in its base form, vanilla. Whereas the dry mix version could be blended in a regular mixer and then poured into an ice cream maker for the final mix in a cold environment, and then immediately enjoyed as some sort of soft serve, or put into a freezer if you wanted a more solid mix, the complex variant needed all of the ingredients prepared in 2 or more bowls. Since all the dry ingredients needed to be blended, the powdered eggs and powdered milk needed to be reconstituted, and then they all had to be combined together and cooked in a bowl over boiling water or in a steam-jacketed kettle for about 20 minutes, whilst being stirred. Then you had to cool it, and then you had to freeze it. This suggests that it was probably only made for special occasions, or perhaps for officers who of course had their own galley, since if you had several hundred or even well over 1,000 crew, batch producing and then flavouring the dry mix version could be done far more quickly and in far larger quantities per batch. For the more complex recipe, you can take a look over at Tasting History's video, a link in the video description below if I remember to do it, and I will try in the background to make my own as well. Luckily, the ingredient reduction from the amount needed for 5 gallons down to a slightly more manageable approximately 1 quart has already been done by Max, so we'll be using his recipe, which is 4 teaspoons of cornstarch, 115 grams of sugar, half a teaspoon of salt, 15 grams of powdered egg, 90 grams of powdered milk, 650 millilitres of cold water, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. I will then make that up as vanilla, and we'll see how that works out later. For the more common dry mix, we'll also have to translate down, since my ice cream maker seems to make somewhere between 3/4 of a litre and a litre, so around about a US quart. And so we will have to make that about that much plain dry mix based ice cream, and then I'm going to serve it into individual bowls for freezing, mixing each one with a measure of flavoured syrup to get a variety of different types. I'm not going to add any food colouring, although the syrup might add a little bit of that colour, and then I'm going to taste test them and see if I can work out which is which, since I won't know which one is which one, because they'll have been in and out of the freezer randomly arranged, and Mrs. Drack will probably handle that bit. And so, over to the kitchen.
Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to Drank's Kitchen. It's been a while. The last time we were here, we were actually pointing that way and we were looking at 18th century hardtack. Today we're going to be making dry mix ice cream, the way the US Navy would have made it. Now, there is one slight difference, well, two slight differences. One, we're not making huge quantities because we're not feeding hundreds and hundreds of people. And secondly, dry mix has moved on a little bit, I think, and so the dry mix that we have, although it's completely neutral dry mix base, which is what they would have had back then, the US Navy version, I'm presuming, probably had dehydrated powdered milk in it. This one doesn't seem to, although, I mean, the ingredients say it has skimmed milk powder in it, but the instructions also say to mix the base with flavour and milk, not water, whereas the US Navy mix used water. But either way, it's a neutral ice cream base. It's fairly standard stuff. So we're going to use milk. Unfortunately, this is kind of designed with industrial quantities. Well, not quite US Navy quantities, but it's a 1.6 kilo bag, and the instructions say 1.6 kilos mixed with 350 grams of flavour and 4 to 5 litres of milk. Now, well, a litre is just under 2 pints. We have about half a litre of milk here, so we're going to have to translate that down. So 4 to 6 litres, we'll take 5 as our median. So if we've got 5 litres of milk on this and we've only got half a litre, so that's quite nice. Let's divide everything through by 10. So if we have 1.6 over 10, that gives us 0.16. So that'll be kilograms. So that's 160 grams of dry mix that we need to use. And then our 350 grams of flavour concentrate or flavoured syrup, which I mentioned already we're going to be using. Again, over 10, that's going to give us 35 grams, which near enough as makes no difference, is 35 ml of flavour syrup. So that gives us an idea of the total amount, but of course we're going to be dividing that through by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 35 over 6 is just a fraction under 11. So about 11 grams of syrup concentrate per serving that we're going to do. And the servings are going to be in these rather fetching bowls, because, well, time is of the essence. Unfortunately, I have 6 flavoured syrups, 5 of which you probably would find in the US Navy. We have peach, we have cherry, we have chocolate, we have banana, and we have strawberry. And we very specifically know that they had 4 of those because they're mentioned in the ingredients. And the other 2, they're fairly easy to make. The last one is caramel because I like caramel. It's not listed in the US Navy cookbook, but I needed a 6th, and the 6th, was the most plausible of the other ones that we've got. Now, obviously, now we know our quantities, we have our scale, and we can start to work on things. So, first things first, I'm going to get a spoon, and we've got our fresh milk. And nice creamy milk. We're going to put half a litre of milk in our measuring jar, and a tiny fraction left over for when somebody has a cup of tea, because of course this is Britain. So back you go in there. Right, that's the easy bit. And now we need to, of course, mood lighting. That is the most efficient way to light a candle, as we all know. There you go, mood lighting candle, everybody. Now, we said we needed 160 grams of this dry mix, which also means I'm going to need a spoon. So we're going to open up this a little bit. We're going to turn on our scales, make sure our scales are set to 0. And in goes the dry mix. 40 grams, 94, 141, 158, 160 exactly. Now, one of the reasons that we're doing it in a relatively small quantities is this poor little mixer can only probably go up to about this much, maybe a fraction more. We'll find out as we go along. So, passing this off screen to Mrs. Drac, who's going to put a peg on it to make sure we don't lose all the freshness. Turns out I didn't need the spoon anyway. And so, dry mix into a glass bowl. Scales out of the way over here. We've got this for scraping into our mixer. Now the mixer does say I need to have the inner bowl prepared for 8 hours in the freezer, which it is. So we're going to need that in a minute. But for the moment, we are going to add our milk to our dry mix. I'm going to put that to one side, and then we're going to take our mixer, and we're going to remember that has a dead man switch. Making sure to get plenty of air in. Mrs. Drake telling me to slow it down. Okay. Apparently she's done this before. I have never made ice cream like this before in my life, so who knows what's going to happen. I mean, it's just kind of a slushy mix. Is that it? Right, so Mrs. Drake, if you could retrieve the pre-frozen bowl from the chest freezer that is behind you. I will keep up a slow but steady mix. And we lift off our bowl there. Ooh, that's cold. Alright, then this goes in here, and it suggests having it switched on already to stop everything freezing to the sides of the bowl. So, then we're going to leave that churning away. Now obviously in the US Navy they would have had substantially larger mixers, and indeed if you go to pretty much any US Navy museum ship that's cruiser size or upwards, so aircraft carriers, battleships, USS Salem, they'll have, you know, something that's like this, except it'll be about this big. And we're just going to leave that churning, and we'll come back once it's finished churning. Right, so we come to you at the other end of the churning process, and it has been pronounced as acceptable. So we don't have that much compared to our 6 containers, so I'm going to have to utilize every last scrap of mix that we've got. So getting it even off of the scraper is going to be key. There we go. Right, that can go in there for the or maybe not. Hang on. Let's move that. There we go. Right, now, where's my spoon? So I've pre-measured out the various syrups. May have gone slightly overboard with the chocolate, but that's never a bad thing. So, tastes like ice cream. Slightly melty ice cream, but already tastes like it. So I'm starting off with 1 large scoop per bowl and seeing where that takes us. Okay, so 1 large scoop per bowl, and I think if I'm any judge of volume, we've probably got enough for a decent 2nd scoop per bowl. So in you go, in you go. In you go. You, I'm being persecuted by a small dog who is not really that small. And the last one. Quite literally scraping the bottom of the barrel. Right, now I mean, it tastes okay. It tastes ice cream-ish, plain. Now, to avoid cross-contamination, 6 spoons, each spoon being used to mix in the syrup. In fact, I'll leave these spoons in there. So given that it's partially melting, because I probably should have stuck these bowls in the freezer to pre-chill them, this is probably going to taste a bit like ice cream that has been part melted and then stuck back in the freezer again. But then again, you know, this is the US Navy in the middle of World War II. We've seen pictures of them eating stuff out of cans. It's not exactly gourmet quality anyway. So open up the freezer. And in they go overnight, and we'll see what we've got tomorrow morning when we're going to start the morning, as everybody should, with an ice cream breakfast. And Mrs. Track will be selecting and feeding them to me. So that's a blind taste test. And at some point I will have to make some additional room for the second batch, which is going to be the more complex batch, which we're going to make now. So welcome back, it's the next day. We skipped the whole making process of the more fancy ice cream, because as I said, you can see that all done on Max Miller's channel, and well, he probably knows what he's doing a bit better than I do, in any case, when it comes to food. So what we have here we have our 6 samples of the standard issue US Navy ice cream, flavoured with various syrups, and we have a bowl of what ostensibly is the slightly more complex vanilla flavoured one. We're going to put that to one side for the minute, and we're going to have a look at these, because as you may have seen towards the end of last night when we were preparing all of this, despite the fact it had gone into the mixer was all nice and frozen, etc. By the time we'd scooped a bunch of it out, it had started to melt. And so in its soft serve state, it was quite soft, quite melty. Now, that's not actually necessarily a fault with our preparation system, because if you look at some of the photos of the period of US Navy sailors enjoying their ice cream, some of which hopefully should be appearing on screen right now, you'll see that quite a lot of the time it is actually quite melty, which isn't much of a surprise considering they're in the Pacific. So while we've got these out, these have been out for about 10-15 minutes, maybe probably about 10 minutes. Initially I was a bit worried, because obviously we left the spoons in and they were pretty much rock solid. I thought, oh, have we completely ruined it? Is it not going to actually come out? But as it turns out, this stuff does actually melt pretty quickly, which is again not necessarily much of a surprise. So we're going to see what each one has come out like. So we've got 4 that look vaguely the same colour, and 2 that have dashes of red in them. So I'm going to guess, for reference, the flavours we put in were banana, chocolate, cherry, peach, strawberry and caramel. Caramel being the only one that's not listed in the US Navy cookbook. I'm going to hazard a guess that the 2 red ones are probably the cherry and the strawberry, but I don't know which is which. So we're going to start off with this generically yellow ice cream. Texture's good. Despite as solid as it might seem, it actually is really nice and soft. I think that's the banana. So So I'm going to put that to one side. The reason why the candle is off today is because whilst we were trying to clear everything in preparation for making the second set of ice cream, Mrs. Drac leaned over to have a look at something and set her hair on fire with a candle. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go, I think that's the banana. In fact, so over there I've got banana, caramel, chocolate, cherry, peach, strawberry. I'm going to try and line it up in the order I think they are. So I think that's banana, so I'm going to put that roughly there. So I think these are the strawberry and the cherry ones. So then we've got a choice of these three. So what's this one first? I'm going to go with, that's chocolate. So that's there. And what is this one going to be? Magical Mystery Ice Cream Tours with Drac. And my choices seem to be caramel or peach. I don't know, it has bits of both, which is weird. Let's try this one. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's peach, which would make that caramel by process of elimination. And then we have the two that are veined with red, and so are, let's have a look and see how my mostly fruit deprived taste buds can tell the difference, if at all. It's a fruit. Maybe the cherry? I'm hoping for a taste like strawberry jam, because I do eat that, and that'll help me zero in. I'm pretty sure that's the strawberry, which would make that the cherry. So in a minute Mrs. Drac will sample and tell us what she thinks they are, because we genuinely have no idea. I just shoved them all in the freezer last night. That'll obviously take place off camera because Mrs. Drac prefers to be off camera, and I'll let you know the results a little bit later. Now, what are we going to do with our slightly more premium mix that we have in a bowl? Well, I made it as vanilla, so, you know, I could just... Okay, so it's a slightly softer texture than the other one. May have slightly overdone it with the vanilla. Apparently Mrs. Drac told me afterwards there is a difference between vanilla extract and vanilla essence. I may have used a bit too much, but I mean, it is very definitely vanilla ice cream. Right, so why is this? Right, well, as I mentioned, as I probably did mention in the video already, in the history portion, there are reports that there was a Coca-Cola barge alongside the ice cream barge at Ulithi. So you could indulge in that wonderful of American inventions, the ice cream float. But of course, the Royal Navy was present also at Ulithi during the latter stages of the Pacific Campaign. And if there's one thing that the Royal Navy has and the US Navy didn't have in any significant quantities during the war, at least officially, it was alcohol. Specifically, obviously, rum and beer. So, fresh off of HMS Victory, we have some HMS Victory rum, Navy strength barrel aged, and I'm advised by the recipe, if such a thing is, for a rum and coke float, that it should be 1/4 rum to 3/4 Coca-Cola. So I'm just eyeballing it here. I mean, that's a disturbingly large amount of rum for a single float, but my hypothesis is that we know Royal Navy sailors traded rum and other alcohols with US Navy sailors for ice cream. That's an established fact. But then once you've got your rum on board, how do you drink it? I mean, you could just drink it covertly, fine, but if you want to be a bit more public about it, I thought, well, you've got a dark rum, and then... And I know some of you are probably screaming at the screen right now for me ruining perfectly good rum, and I may be somewhat on board with that sentiment. But, you see, magically, the rum has disappeared. I just have a slightly odd-smelling glass of Coca-Cola, so I didn't actually need that one, so I'll put that over there. And then some of my rapidly melting vanilla ice cream. So this is my semi-hypothetical rum and Coca-Cola ice cream float, which your theoretical, rather ambitious US Navy sailor might well have enjoyed of a cold evening in Ulithi or shortly thereafter, as a way to indulge in both of the great food and drink stuffs that the Royal Navy and the US Navy could provide, whilst also remaining covert from all of his officers. So it's actually tracing down really nicely. That's fascinating. Also, the bubbles are growing disturbingly. That's strong. Okay, let's get this a bit more mixed. That's nicely chilling. The bubble level is stable but very strong. As you can see, we've kind of got a reverse bubbleization process going on. Now, the only problem with the bubbles being this deep and this dense is it's going to be very difficult to actually drink what's left of the liquid without pouring bubbles everywhere, but I shall give it a go in the spirit of international cooperation. Okay, that is genuinely good. That is genuinely really nice. And that activity has stirred the bubbles up quite a bit, and they are growing once more. So, rum and coke vanilla ice cream float, the ultimate combination of the Ultimate Alliance in the Western Pacific, and a whole slew of various standard issue ice creams that you might get more normally. And Floppy the dog really would like some of his own, but he can't have some because this is all dairy. Sorry, Floppy. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this live segment, and now back to regular narration.
According to Mrs. Track's refined palate, and I trust her on this because she actually eats fruits and vegetables on a semi-regular basis, unlike myself, I actually got the flavour identification of the banana, caramel, and peach completely wrong. So what I thought was banana was actually caramel, what I thought was caramel was actually peach, and what I thought was peach was actually banana. But go figure. I mean, they all tasted fairly nice. So, there you go. US Navy ice cream. I hope that's added a little bit more to your knowledge. It certainly added a little bit more to my diet. And hope to see you again in another video. Bye.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.